They laughed while she built it, mocked her from behind their mittens with cracking lips and half-frozen beards. But they weren't laughing when the snow crushed the Price family's roof flat, or when the Macaulay baby turned blue before sunrise. By then, the widow's second wall didn't look so ridiculous. It began on the coldest day of early October, a freeze that arrived 2 months too early, snapping limbs off trees, frosting the well buckets to stone, and killing 4 chickens where they stood. Martha Greeley stood alone in her yard, holding a hammer with one stiff-gloved hand and steadying a warped log beam against the corner post of her cabin with the other. Her 3 children watched from inside the house, faces pressed to the window's foggy pane. The youngest, Beth, not yet 4, whimpering at the loud cracks of the wind. She could hardly hear it anymore. The wind had been howling for so many days now that it no longer registered. Not the groaning of timbers, not the rustle of bark torn from frozen birches, not the low, dull moan that swept across the valley like a wolf that never stopped hunting. She didn't feel her fingers either. She didn't feel much of anything since Harold died in May. They said he shouldn't have gone out after that last snow melt, not with the horses that thin and the river running high. But he'd done it anyway. Had to ride down to Placerville for nails, salt, flour. Hadn't come back. 2 weeks later, a Shoshone trapper rode up and handed her his belt buckle and half a boot. Never said a word, just dropped them in her hand and rode off into the pine fog like a ghost. She didn't scream, didn't weep, just turned and went inside. But now she was building something that none of them understood. A second wall, around the cabin, a few feet wider on each side, with space in between. What for? The men asked each other at the trading post. She thinking the logs are too ugly to look at? Some of them said she was going mad with grief. One said maybe she thought if she built another house around the old one, Harold might walk in from the woods and not realize he'd been gone. They didn't know the truth. She hadn't told anyone what she'd seen last March. She hadn't spoken of the frost line. That's what she called it. It wasn't something you could see with the eye unless you knew where to look. But one morning near the end of last winter, when the stove had burned out, and all 4 of them huddled under every blanket in the house, she'd laid her hand on the inside wall and felt death creeping through it. It wasn't like a draft. It wasn't a hole or a crack or a breeze. It was a sensation that began at the wrist, wormed into the palm, and left the bones aching like they'd been steeped in snowmelt. She knew then that the walls were giving up. A week later, a log cracked clean through on the north face. So all that summer, between tending what little grew in their stunted garden and trying to keep her children alive, she'd worked, quietly, thinking, observing, asking questions in her head. She began stacking stones around the chicken coop to see how the wind moved. She laid brush against the barn wall and checked it each morning to see what parts were frozen and what stayed dry. It took her months to admit it, but she realized their log cabin had been built wrong. Too many gaps, too much exposure, not enough thermal mass. So she formed a plan that nobody else on the frontier had the time, the will, or the desperation to consider. Build a second outer wall, a buffer zone, not fancy, not tight-fit joinery, just a crude second ring of walls a few feet away from the cabin proper. A crude air barrier, windbreak, heat trap. She didn't care what they called it. And when the cold hit early that year, she didn't hesitate. By the time frost killed the remaining cabbages and turned the latrine trench to stone, the first section of outer wall was up, not finished, not sealed, but standing. The space between it and the cabin filled with straw and dirt, packed hard. The roofline didn't match, and some of the men from town had the gall to ride up and shake their heads like they were mourning a sin. "Shame what happens to women out here alone," one had whispered, not knowing she stood behind the door. She heard every word, but she didn't stop. Not even when Beth got sick and started coughing blood. Not even when the boys came back from gathering firewood with frostbitten toes. She simply kept working. At night, she lit the stove and measured the wall temperatures with her hand. And each time the outer wall grew, the inner one got warmer. She kept her records. December brought a hard freeze, the worst anyone had seen since the settlers pushed up into the Idaho Valley 5 winters ago. The Macaulays lost 2 cows in one night. The Crawfords found a coyote frozen stiff in their barn doorway. Children who slept near the outer walls in every other house turned blue-lipped and silent until sunrise, but not hers. The cabin with the second wall stayed 27 degrees warmer than the next nearest home. She knew because she'd snuck over to the Crawfords with a homemade thermometer and checked their wall temperatures at dawn. Her hands shook the whole way back, not from cold, but from the realization that she'd done something no man in the valley had the sense to try. And yet none of them believed it. They still whispered about her, still looked sideways when she came to town, until the storm came. The real one. It started with a sound unlike any wind before, a high, fluting scream that came from the treetops, like some ice spirit warning the valley to run. No one could run. The snow hit like a mountain falling. It snapped trunks, buried roofs, and after the first night it killed the Price boy. Only 8. By the third day, 7 roofs had collapsed. 4 families had moved into the trading post, the schoolhouse, Chimney cracked down the middle and fell in. Fires were started, then died, then weren't started again. But Martha's cabin stood, even with the second wall weighed down by snow, even as the temperature dropped to 30 below. Inside, her children were warm enough to sleep. Then came the knock, someone at her door. When she opened it, 3 women stood outside, blankets over their heads, holding infants, faces pale and shivering. One had blood on her sleeve. Behind them, more figures moved through the snow, men, children, one limping with help. She stared at them for a long moment, then stepped aside. The second wall had worked, but letting them in was only the beginning. The first thing Martha noticed wasn't how many had come. It was how quiet they were. They didn't beg, they didn't cry, they didn't even explain themselves. They simply filed in, shoulders hunched, faces hollowed by windburn, expressions too worn to carry shame anymore. She counted 17 people by the time the last had entered. Families she'd known, some she hadn't, their shapes hunched like shadows inside torn coats, boots tied together with twine, lips swollen with cold. No one said her wall was foolish now. Her own children stared from the loft, wide-eyed and silent as these ghost figures shuffled across their floor. A man, Mr. Abelson, the wheelwright who once laughed loudest at her build, carried his daughter wrapped in a horse blanket. Her lips were blue. She looked no older than 6. He said nothing, only met Martha's eyes for a flicker of a second before turning away and sinking to his knees near the stove. The cabin was not large, but the second wall had added enough space between the rooms and outer logs that there was room to move, room to breathe. Martha had laid wooden planks and split logs between the cabin and the outer wall to create a kind of walkway, an air buffer that now held thick straw, sealed with frozen mud and wattle. That strange ring, mocked all autumn, had become a miracle. They stayed close together without instruction. They slept in shifts on the floor. She used every blanket, every hide, even pulled the curtains down to make ground covers. She fed them from the cellar until the food began to disappear faster than it could be counted. She boiled roots and thin oat gruel, made broth from the remaining ham bones, and she kept her records. Each morning, while the rest slept or stirred listlessly, she checked the inner and outer wall surfaces by touch, and jotted notes in a charred scrap of ledger paper Harold once used for trapping logs. She wrote down every thermal difference she could sense. The corner nearest the northeast post stayed coldest. The south-facing outer wall warmed quickest once the sun hit it, even through clouds. The mud insulation held heat longer than raw straw alone. But these thoughts did little to distract her from the sound that came each night. A low wailing, a soft, trembling moan, sometimes a whisper, sometimes louder, always from the edge of the forest. At first she thought it might be wolves, but the noise didn't move like wolves. It lingered, it wept. Some nights she thought it was Harold. After 4 days, one of the boys from the Miller family tried to go back for a dog they'd left behind. He opened the door while Martha was in the cellar with Beth. By the time she reached the front, the door was still swinging, wind pouring in like knives. She slammed it shut, bolted it, and ran out the back, slipping through the rear vestibule tunnel she'd dug by hand months earlier. She found him face down in the snow, 10 feet from the cabin. His hands were white, his eyes unfocused. She dragged him back through the snow chute and down into the root cellar, where she kept the oil warmer and the best seal against wind. It took 4 hours of heat, broth, and steady rubbing to bring life back into his limbs. Afterward, she didn't scold him. She didn't need to. He wept on her shoulder for a long time, sobbing about the dog, said he could still hear it scratching at the trees. That's when Martha realized something was wrong, not just with the cold, with the sound, because she heard it too, every night, the same faint scratching. But she'd buried the dog herself. She'd buried all the animals they couldn't feed when the storm hit, the chickens, the ox that wouldn't rise. She'd dug pits by hand, frozen soil be damned, and covered them deep with snow and dirt. So whatever they were hearing, it wasn't a dog. On the 7th day of storm, the roof of the trading post collapsed. Word came from the last horse messenger that barely made it to the ridge. The remaining settlers who hadn't frozen outright were heading to the schoolhouse, planning to dig trenches to survive. No one expected them to last. The settlers inside Martha's cabin began murmuring of leaving, of going to help, but Martha told them what she'd seen. The man's horse hadn't made it. He came stumbling through snow without it, collapsed. Martha had dragged him into the vestibule and set a heated stone beside his hands to keep the frostbite at bay. She watched his chest rise and fall all through the night. The next morning, he was gone, but not fled. There were no tracks, no sound, no door unlatched, only his coat left in the vestibule and his boots still near the fire. She didn't tell the children. She just sealed the back chute tighter with straw and started sleeping with the axe by the door. The days dragged, the food thinned. Martha reduced rations, 1 scoop of gruel per person. The infants cried at night, then stopped crying altogether. Her own daughter, Beth, stopped speaking for a while, just clung to her older brother, Amos, and stared at the door. The scratching got louder. Each night it came from a different direction, sometimes the front wall, sometimes behind the root cellar door, once, unmistakably, from beneath the floor. Mr. Abelson, once silent, finally broke down and asked her if she believed in spirits. "My father always said the snow could carry voices," he muttered, "that the wind weren't just wind up here, that it learned what it heard and said it back." Martha didn't reply, but later that night, as the wind rose like a chorus of screams through the pines, she wondered whether the wall had trapped more than just warmth. By the 12th day, food had run out. Martha had known it would come. She'd saved a small stash in a secret spot beneath the stove, the place Harold once kept whiskey from the preacher's wife. But it wouldn't last more than 2 days. She announced nothing. She simply stepped outside with her coat and shovel and began digging through the snow wall toward the spot where the Macaulay's old wagon had been abandoned near the ravine last autumn. There might still be flour there, or oats, or, God willing, salted meat. When she returned, hours later, she wasn't alone. Behind her trudged 2 children, wrapped in what looked like parts of a horse blanket and an old tarp. She hadn't known them by name, but she'd seen them before, children of the Nordell family, who lived 2 ridges east. Their faces were blackened by cold, their eyes dull. Only when she got them inside and the blanket fell did she see the girl's hand. It was black, the whole hand. She didn't hesitate. She took the hatchet, laid her on the floor near the fire, bit down on a leather belt, and when the screams came, she didn't flinch. The second wall echoed faintly with every cry. That night, she heard the wind again. It whispered her name. "Martha." It came 3 times, clear as words. The settlers huddled. No one slept. When morning came, there was a knock. Just one, firm, measured, at the front. Every head in the cabin turned, but Martha didn't reach for the latch. She stared at the door, listened, and when no voice followed it, when no second knock came, she said what no one else dared. "That's not a person." No one opened it, not that day, not the next. But by the 3rd night, the whispering changed, became pleading, then angry, then it said her son's name, and Amos stood up. He stood like someone waking up from a long sleep, slowly, stiffly, not fully himself. His cheeks were sallow, his eyelids heavy, and he didn't look at Martha as he stepped toward the door. He just kept his eyes fixed on the gap between the lintel and the frame, where the light from the stove barely touched. The room froze. 17 people inside, and not one moved, not one breathed loud. Martha took a single step forward and whispered his name, "Amos!" But he didn't stop, didn't blink. The girl whose hand had been taken, Anna, whimpered softly from the pile of hides where she lay, her little mouth chapped, eyes darting. Amos reached the door and raised his hand to the latch. "Martha!" The voice again, this time from the other side. Gentle, familiar, too familiar. It was Harold's voice, but Harold had been dead since spring, and Martha had buried the last of what the river returned. The buckle, the boot, her chest turned to stone. Her mouth couldn't form words. "Amos," the voice said, "it's all right now. Come outside. I found the horse. We can ride back down the mountain. I've got the flour. Everything's all right now. Mama's waiting." But Mama was right there. That's when Martha moved, fast and without breath, grabbing the iron skillet from beside the stove and hurling it toward the door with all the strength she had left. It struck the frame just as Amos's fingers reached the latch. The noise was like a thunder crack in the cramped cabin. Amos recoiled, as if waking from a dream, and stumbled backward, eyes wild. "No one opens the door," Martha said, her voice lower than anyone had ever heard it. "No one, not unless the sun's up and I'm standing with you." Everyone looked at her, but it was Amos who began to shake. His hands trembled as he stumbled back to his corner. Martha crossed to him and pulled him into her arms. He didn't speak for the rest of the night. They didn't sleep, any of them. The knocking returned twice, then the voice of another, one of the Price girls, who'd frozen earlier that week, then a third, speaking with Mr. Abelson's accent. Each time the voice was too real, too exact, and each time no one moved toward the door again. But something shifted in the air after that, something beyond hunger, beyond cold. It was despair. When morning came, light filtered through the cracks in the outer wall, a soft, hazy silver, and Martha could tell the storm had begun to lift. The silence outside was heavier than before, the wind no longer howling but still biting in its stillness. Like the forest had stopped breathing. She took stock of what little they had left. The secret food stash under the stove was nearly gone. Her own children looked ghost pale, lips cracked and fingers curled beneath blankets for warmth. The stove burned weak, fueled now with stripped furniture and floorboards taken from the back rooms. There was no longer enough to survive another week, which meant there was no choice left. "We go to the schoolhouse," Martha said. The settlers looked up, bleary eyes, worn faces. Mr. Abelson was the first to protest. "You said the men there are digging in. They won't last." "They won't," Martha said, "unless we help them." The silence stretched. "They're trying to dig trenches in frost that hasn't thawed in a month," she continued. "They don't have straw walls. They don't have the structure. But we do. I know how to build it now, and the storm's weakening. There's a window. We take what we've learned, and we help them build a second wall there, around the schoolhouse." "They won't listen to you," someone muttered. "They will, if we come bearing proof," Martha replied. "They'll listen when they see 17 of us survived in what they called a death box." It was madness. It was also the only choice left. By noon, the sun broke faintly through the grey. A haze, not warmth, but a shift. Martha made the children rest one last hour, then organized the group into pairs, every child wrapped in all the clothing they could find, every man carrying wood or straw or whatever could be spared. She gave Beth her father's old coat, the one with the mended sleeve. She gave Anna, whose hand had been taken, one of her own gloves, sewn shut at the tip to cover the bandages, and then they opened the door. The cold hit like a slap, dry and absolute. It seared the lungs, cracked the skin, bit into eyes like ash. But there was no wind, only the eerie quiet of a snow-blanketed world that hadn't moved in weeks. Trees drooped under layers of ice, their branches misshapen like twisted bones. The trail was impassable. The snow reached higher than the fences, so they didn't walk it, they climbed. Martha led them across the snow crust, moving over the deep powder like foxes, slow and light. She'd lived on this ridge for 7 years, and knew every slope, every ditch, every drift. But now it all looked different, like another world had swallowed the old one. They reached the bluff by dusk. Smoke curled weakly from the schoolhouse chimney, black against the white sky. Someone had managed to keep a fire burning, but barely. The windows were sealed, the porch buried. Martha stopped the group and pointed to the spot where they would build the second wall. "The buffer. We do it like the cabin," she said. 2 feet clearance, straw between, mud if we can get it, stones to weigh the base. No one questioned her, because by then, even the proudest among them had learned survival wasn't about being right, it was about being warm. They were halfway through laying the first beam when the door to the schoolhouse flew open. A gaunt figure stepped out, rifle in hand. Behind him, others followed. "Martha Greeley!" the man barked, shocked. It was Reverend Hill. "Thought you were dead," he muttered. "Not yet," she said. He stared at the group, at the children, the shivering men, the bundles of straw and rope and salvaged logs. His rifle dropped. "What is this?" "It's what kept us alive," she said, and turned back to the wall. "Now help us build it around you." For the next 3 hours, they worked in silence, shaping the framework with hands that barely felt the tools they held. The children passed stones, the men packed straw. Martha moved among them like a ghost, orchestrating, correcting, directing, and by nightfall, the second wall stood, crude, uneven, but there. The temperature inside the schoolhouse rose by 12 degrees that night. By the next day, 17 more arrived. And that's when the true test began, because a second wall brought you heat, but it couldn't make food. Martha rationed down to water boiled with bark. She led 3 expeditions to salvage caches buried beneath the ice, broken cellars, fallen barns. She once pried open a wagon buried beneath 10 feet of snow to find a half-barrel of dried beans, and wept without a sound. And the voice kept calling, every night. Only now others heard it too. It called names, told lies, recounted memories only family could know. It lured them with warmth, with promises. "It's over now. The freeze has passed. Come outside. We're safe." But Martha reminded them each time, "We didn't survive because of hope. We survived because of caution. If you listen to that voice, you'll end up frozen in the trees." The children believed her. The adults began to. And when the worst of it finally broke, when the southern sun returned like a reluctant parent, late and ashamed, Martha's second wall remained standing, all of it, even as others collapsed, even as the forest shed its snow and the river began to run again. Not everyone had survived, but those who had owed it to her wall, the one they laughed at. The thaw didn't arrive all at once. It came in uncertain stutters, melting a layer of snow here, cracking a patch of ice there, only to freeze again the next night. Streams began trickling beneath the snow, unseen but heard, whispering underneath the still buried ground like secret veins of spring. And still, Martha did not let her guard down, because she knew what came after cold wasn't always warmth. Sometimes it was hunger, sometimes sickness, and sometimes madness. The schoolhouse had become a haphazard sanctuary. With the second wall up and holding heat like a kettle, more survivors began arriving. Pale, frostbitten, hollow-eyed men and women from cabins farther down the slope, families who had dug pits under their floorboards or huddled in barns with dead livestock to stay alive. Some had stories, others had only silence. Most brought nothing but the clothes on their backs and the ache of starvation in their guts. They came because of the wall, because someone had told them, or they'd seen, that a widow up the ridge had built a ring of logs around her cabin and lived, that she'd sealed the gap with straw, sealed it again with mud, packed it with stones and scraps and brush, and trapped the warmth inside like a miracle. That she'd done what every man in the valley had failed to do, so they came to learn and to survive. The wall around the schoolhouse now had additional rows. Each day, while the snow softened just enough, men cut branches, women packed straw, children dragged twine and old canvas sacks to plug holes. Martha became the center without asking to be, not a leader by title but by presence. When something cracked, they called her. When someone collapsed, they looked to her. When Reverend Hill wept quietly over a death and couldn't finish his sermon, it was Martha who stood in his place and read the Psalms in a voice stripped bare of theatrics. Only truth, only grit. Still, no one knew how she stood upright. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night in weeks. Her ribs showed through her blouse. Her boots were split at the sides. Her lips bled when she spoke, but she kept moving, because the moment she stopped, she'd have to feel the full weight of everything she'd seen and everything she'd lost, like what they found when the thaw hit the lower ridge. It was a party of 3 men who'd gone searching for buried caches, old jerky, sacks of oats, tools. They stumbled on the Price cabin, half collapsed. Inside, they found something none of them could speak of directly. One man tried to describe it to Martha in the snow outside the schoolhouse, but stopped halfway through a sentence and began retching into the slush. That was when they started burning bodies. It wasn't out of disrespect. It was necessity. Some of the dead hadn't died from cold. They'd died from what comes after, when hunger turns human minds to dust and desperation to teeth. And Martha, more than any of them, knew that mercy wasn't always soft. She built a pyre that night with what dry timber remained, and those too far gone to bury were given to flame, beneath a sky turning orange at the edge. And still, the voice whispered. Even with the storm waning, even with the wind less violent, the voice remained, just outside the walls. It no longer spoke names with urgency. It didn't beg, it waited, it echoed, sometimes in 2 places at once. Once, while Martha stirred broth over the schoolhouse fire, she heard it call Beth's name from both sides of the building at the same time. No one else seemed to notice, and that's when she began to suspect something else had followed them. It hadn't stayed in the valley. It had learned. It had moved. She tested the second wall again, walked it twice a day, checked the cold seep at each timber joint. The outer layer was holding, but there were gaps she couldn't account for, odd wet spots inside that had no explanation, condensation in the wrong corners, a draft that moved in reverse. She knew architecture, knew airflow, and this wasn't normal. On the 14th day since they'd built the schoolhouse wall, a child disappeared. Not one of hers, a boy from the Allen family. He was 6, went out the side vestibule to relieve himself at dawn. Gone. No tracks, no sound, no scent for the dogs, which were barely alive themselves. The mother screamed for 3 days straight. Reverend Hill declared a prayer vigil. Martha built another wall, this time not a thermal barrier, a true wall, 6 feet high, packed snow and log and stone all around the outer edge of the schoolhouse's perimeter. A fortress. She told them it was to block the next storm, but it wasn't. It was to keep something out, and maybe, just maybe, to keep something in. By March, the snow was melting in waves. The schoolhouse yard had patches of earth. The pine boughs sagged with damp instead of ice. You could hear birds again, distantly, but the food had run out again, and so had the fuel. People started taking chances. That's when Mr. Abelson made the worst mistake of all. He tried to go back to his cabin alone. He left at dawn, didn't tell anyone, thought he could make it to the East Ridge and return before nightfall with the last of his winter stores, or even just tools to hunt. He never came back. But at dusk, the schoolhouse door rattled. Everyone froze. Then a voice. "It's me," it said. It was Abelson's voice. "I made it back. I got the flour." But he'd never said he was going for flour. Only Martha knew that. She was at the door before anyone could move, stood with her ear against the wood, listened. The voice was wrong, not in tone, in rhythm, in breath. The pauses were too exact, the words too even. She whispered a test. "Do you remember what you gave me last week?" she asked softly, loud enough for the voice to hear. A pause, then a blanket, but he hadn't. He'd given her nothing. It was a lie, a guess. She bolted the door harder and turned to the room. "No one opens it," she said. And that night, the knocking came again. All night, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, sometimes it scratched, sometimes it sobbed. And in the morning they found 2 sets of footprints leading away from the threshold, not toward the woods, around the building, circling, twice, and then nothing. The second wall had held heat, the third wall had held them in, but something out there still wanted in, or perhaps something inside wanted out. That morning Beth wouldn't wake. Martha shook her, called her name, no response. Her lips were blue again, her hands stiff, but she wasn't dead, just distant. She carried her daughter into the sunlight, sat against the outer wall where the heat gathered best, held her, rocked her, sang the song Harold used to hum when splitting logs in the morning. For an hour, nothing changed. Then Beth blinked. She whispered, "Papa said we should leave the walls behind." Martha's blood turned to ice. She clutched her tighter, turned her face to the sun, and whispered into her ear, "We are the walls." Because she understood now. The warmth had saved them, but it had drawn something to them, and they would have to decide soon, not just how to stay alive, but whether to open the door at all. The thaw didn't bring relief, it brought revelation. By April, snowmelt poured in sheets down the slope, carving deep grooves into the valley. Trees, stripped of their winter frost, now leaned like broken sentries. The wind lost its voice, and the air no longer screamed through the ridgelines. And yet the schoolhouse, ringed in 3 walls, remained tense, like a coffin waiting to be sealed. Martha hadn't slept in 3 days. Beth still spoke of Harold in her sleep, only now she didn't call him Papa, she called him the one behind the wall, and she pointed to the outermost layer, the high-packed barrier Martha had built not for warmth, but to keep the dark at bay. Others had begun to notice too. Little things, objects out of place, a hammer found on the wrong bench, a child's mitten on the wrong side of the wall, a wooden carving someone swore they'd burned for firewood reappearing in the vestibule the next morning. The changes were small, but they unsettled even the most rational. Then finally someone opened the door. It happened just before sunrise, while the rest slept in huddled silence. A man named Cutter, no family, no friends left in the valley, had been whispering to himself for days. He'd insisted that the voices outside had changed, that they were warning them now, that something in the woods was watching, not hunting. He left quietly. They found his footprints the next morning, walking straight out past the 3rd wall. No struggle, no dragging, just a clean path into the trees, where the last snow clung to the roots. His body was never found, but the wall had been breached. By midday, Martha gathered the settlers. There were just under 30 of them now, survivors from scattered homesteads, most barely alive when they arrived, some still coughing blood, others already dead and buried beneath the pine ridge. She stood before them, with her boots still wet from sealing the breach, and her voice did not shake. "We leave tomorrow," she said. A silence fell, heavy as a stone. "Where?" someone asked. "Anywhere south, past the valley bend, past the meltwater, to soil that hasn't been cursed by this storm, to a place without voices in the trees." "They won't let us," someone whispered. "They?" she asked. Whoever it was didn't answer, and that night the knocking returned. But this time, it didn't come from the door or the back vestibule, or even beneath the floorboards. It came from inside the 3rd wall, soft, measured, 3 knocks, and then silence. The group didn't sleep. They sat with their backs to one another in a circle, watching every plank, every seam. The fire was kept low. No one dared look toward the windows, and as the hours dragged into morning, the light returned not with birdsong or wind, but with a scream. A girl, 9 years old, her mother's only child. She had disappeared. No tracks, no sound, no open door, only her scarf, wet and shredded, found near the rear wall, where frost had begun to regrow in strange patterns. That was the final straw. At dawn, Martha led them from the schoolhouse. No debates, no votes. They packed what remained: 3 bags of dried beans, a pot, 2 flintlocks with 8 rounds between them, and whatever strength they could carry. She held Beth in one arm, Amos guiding beside her, and behind them followed a line of the broken and the brave. They marched down the slope in silence. The walls stood behind them, half-shadowed by mist, the outermost layer already beginning to collapse under the warming air. No one looked back, not until they reached the bottom of the ridge, when the sun, for the first time in weeks, broke fully through the clouds and bathed the valley in gold. There the last man in line turned and gasped, because the schoolhouse was gone. Not destroyed, not buried, just gone. Nothing but snow and silence, as if it had never been there. He opened his mouth to speak, but Martha didn't stop walking. She just clutched Beth tighter and said, "We aren't meant to know why." They didn't speak much in the days that followed. They moved steadily south, following the melt. They passed cabins filled with bodies, root cellars that had become tombs, and the carcasses of animals half-thawed and crawling with early flies. They shared food in whispers. Martha taught them how to judge wind direction by smell, how to build a heat pocket in a ditch using only pine boughs and canvas, how to press a fire into a hollow log to keep coals alive overnight. And slowly they left the voice behind. It didn't follow them past the river. It didn't whisper in their ears or call names after dusk. It didn't knock. Only once, on the 5th night south of the valley, did Martha think she saw something, just past the tree line, where the moonlight didn't reach. A tall shape, still, watching, but when she blinked it was gone. They reached the trading post ruins by the 2nd week of April. Most of the roof was gone. The back wall had caved, but beneath the floor, still dry in the root pit, they found sealed jars, apples, pickled cabbage, 2 barrels of rye grain, enough to eat. They built fires in the rubble, slept under open skies for the first time in months. The children smiled. Some laughed, and when Beth spoke again, her voice was clear. "I think Papa's really gone now." now?" she said. Martha didn't reply, just held her daughter close. They stayed a week, then moved on again, to the next ridge, the next cabin, the next place with dry wood and a working stove. And wherever they settled next, Martha taught them how to build, not just a cabin, not just a roof, a second wall. Always, they called her the widow with the warm house. Some made jokes. Some said she'd seen too much. Some whispered the storm had broken her mind. But others listened. Others watched as her walls stood firm, while theirs cracked, as her hearths held coals when theirs froze, as her children grew strong, while theirs fell sick. They stopped laughing. By the following winter, 4 families had built second walls. By the next, a dozen. Years passed. The old settlers faded. New ones arrived. The schoolhouse was never found again. Some claimed it was buried under a fresh landslide. Others said it had simply vanished, swallowed by the woods. Martha never spoke of it. She died 15 years later, peacefully, in her sleep, beside a stone stove that never failed, inside a cabin warm enough to save a village, surrounded by 3 walls. And her children told the story, not of the storm, or the voice, or the vanishings, but of the woman who survived them all, because she built one more wall when the world said she shouldn't, and it stayed 27 warmer.